Dearly beloved, we are gathered here together with a deep sadness in our hearts to lay to rest those whose history may decide was the most sterling citizen our country has known, our purest hero. Ma and Pa Grower passed away at home while waiting for a buyer. That buyer, alas, never came.
Well, where is he?
He's going to come, dear. He always has made it.
He's never this late.
Oh, no. You remember back in 7... See, he's here. It's the buyer. Hey. Ma and Pa Grower. Who are you?
Who are you?
Bob Russell. I'm the Humboldt County Cannabis Inspector who's here to make sure that you are all in line and compliant. Do you have a Category 4 road? No.
No.
Do you have 1.5 million gallons of water stored on your property?
No.
Do you have archaeological surveys?
No.
Do you have biological reports?
No.
Do you even have a dab ring?
What?
You're clearly not compliant. Song! Seize their property! Heart attack! Stroke! Make sure you get the pressure canner! And look for a copy of Stalking the Wild Asparagus! It's been out of print, and I've been looking for one for years.
With sympathy, great love, and admiration, we remember Ma and Pa, for they had created almost without effort an agricultural economic empire that influenced every life in the Emerald Triangle for the last 45 years. Ma and Pa began their pursuit of a higher life shortly after they fled the San Francisco's Haight-Ashbury district in the late 60s. They arrived in Humboldt struggling to escape the man, and despite their unlimited energy, enthusiasm, intellect, and willingness to get naked in public, Ma and Pa found it difficult just to pay the bills. Ma and Pa heard a plaintive call from their urban brethren who remained marooned with only swag weed from south of the border.
Hey man, all we got is swag weed from down south of the border, and like it costs $30 a lid, man. Can you help a brother out?
Hold on for just a minute. You said $30 an ounce.
That's right.
Aha!
Ma and Pa quickly rose to this noble challenge and immediately went to work applying the lessons of real science. They learned the revolutionary cultivation processes needed to keep their urban brethren happy and comatose on their couches. This radical new technological development based on sexual frustration and unrequited love became known as sensimilla. Shortly thereafter, Ma and Pa found themselves miraculously able to pay the bills and to continue their somewhat haphazard homesteading plans, including continued construction of their permanently incomplete and completely unpermitted homes.
Sweetheart, it's our 20th anniversary. You think we could put a little sheetrock up?
Sheetrock. What a great name for the next kid.
For several years, Ma and Pa enjoyed an adventurous lifestyle, but not an especially restful one, given that families had evolved to the point where mothers with a normal complement of 2 arms could, at moment's notice, hustle 3 children and 4 mature ganja plants off into the woods to avoid arrest.
Oh, come on, kids! Foreskin, kohlrabi, red patch. Hurry up! We're getting camped. Grab a couple of those plants. Okay, sweetheart, you don't have to go. Mother's not going to make you do anything you don't want to do. Don't forget, you're going to get arrested.
During this darkest of time, Ma and Pa closed the redwood curtain and took their operations and their polypipe deeper into the hills. With the passage of Proposition 215 in 1996, Ma and Pa, naturally worn with the rigors of guerrilla growing, launched one last ingenious manifestation of their extreme creativity. This required the covering of vast tracts of land with sheet plastic and steel and deploying generator capacity equal to that of the Allied invasion of Normandy. They were abetted in this enterprise by the timely reappearance of their offspring, who recently returned from the country's finest seats of learning, where they had been systematically stripped of the last vestiges of moral values and their affection for kale with which they had left home. Ma and Pa always donated their time generously and can be credited with many of the social and public services our area has become so well known for. In an orgasmic spasm of social and environmental consciousness, Ma and Pa started nonprofits, restoration groups,
Oh.
public radio stations, health clinics, schools, and yoga classes, teaching positions most of us never even thought possible, all over the Emerald Triangle. In fact, at one point they had to attend so many weekly meetings that their work weeks quickly exceeded that of the average Japanese CEO. In the off-season, Ma and Pa arm wrestled with corporate giants like the massively corrupt Maxam Corp that owned most of our county government.
Oh, I've got a meeting to attend to. You'll have to excuse me.
Their generosity and political power accrued from it has been an inspiration to untold thousands, to both straights and those regularly ripped out of their gourds. In 2016, voters who could care less about nonprofits, public radio, and loud reggae music came to Ma and Pa's rescue. Proposition 64 passed by a wide margin, and the trudge towards legalized cannabis was well underway. Friends began to understand the end game Ma and Pa were trapped in shortly after the Compassionate Use Act created a mass migration of foreign drug lords, capitalists, industrial growers, and multicultural young workers from 177 different nations to the Emerald Triangle. Ma and Pa's unfailing instincts for hospitality kept them busy renting porta potties and cooking meals for this transplanted workforce. During those days, plummeting prices, green rushers, and the march of cedar fences across the landscape caused even their annual winter trips to Hawaii to be filled with anxiety. In the end, the hand that Ma and Pa fought so hard their whole life delivered the final blow. Local and state government agencies promised voters they would reward Ma and Pa for their years of hard work and economic development by limiting vertical integration and offering an acreage cap so that Ma and Pa could establish themselves in the new regulated cannabis marketplace. To our disappointment, these promises were entirely revoked in the 11th hour through corporate manipulation of our weak-kneed government decision makers.
Let's throw this one to the bone and sprinkle a little fennel on top for spice. All restrictions on corporate industrial marijuana growing are lifted. You hippies had your turn.
As the county descends into another economic bust cycle, Ma and Pa will always be remembered and revered as they represented a generation of hard-working, creative, rural intelligence who found a way to make their lives and the lives of those around them better, all while still using a funky outhouse. Your Honor, what are you rolling?
Why, it's called Ma and Pa, old school.
Oh,
It's the best. Why don't you try some?
well, thank you. Thank you.
Father.
Ma? Fortunately, the newly arrived cannabis kids in a stone multi-generational agricultural cooperative have ensured that Ma and Pa's ethics and morals will live on. In memory of Ma and Pa, and in response to the creative challenge inherent in the 6 plants per household legal limit, the Cannabis Kids have bred a super botanical form. It goes by the trade name of
Motherfucker!
and produces 32 to 48.5 pounds per plant, depending on how much product of their patented fertilizer product called placenta meal is applied. High nitrogen placenta meal, $19.95, available 7 days a week at placentameal.com. Ma and Pa, rest in peace.
Hold on a second.
Oh, we're connected.
Sorry. No, we're okay. Sounds great.
Are we plugged in?
We should be. Yeah.
Okay, so we don't want to go too far away.
Well, this is a tough act to follow. Absolutely wonderful. My name is Josh Mizell. I'm a professor of sociology at Humboldt State University. I'm also a co-director of the Humboldt Institute for Interdisciplinary Marijuana Research. And just very briefly, I want to tell you my introduction to Scott's work in the Chronic Freedom series. I had the fortune or misfortune of meeting with documentary filmmakers over a year ago who produced a documentary that some of you may have now seen. I think it's called Murder Mountain, something to that effect. I tried to provide a more complicated, nuanced account of how we ought to be thinking about the history of this region and not just strictly focus on violence, and think about this region across time and historically. And during our conversation, one of the filmmakers told me about the Chronic Freedom series. I immediately contacted Scott in Berlin, and we started to have a conversation about how we could bring this here. And so this has been actually, I know this is a much longer project than obviously my involvement, but I'm super excited to see everyone here, that we are hosting this event. This is a collaborative co-sponsorship with Special Collections and the HSU Library, the Humboldt Institute for Interdisciplinary Marijuana Research, and we also have sponsorship from the Altruistic Behavior Institute. Thank you. I have trouble with that. In case you're interested in HIMR, we've been around since 2012. We are the only chartered cannabis research center in the Cal State system, and as far as I know, the first interdisciplinary cannabis research institute associated with the university in the United States. And our website is HIMR, HIIMR.humboldt.edu. We have a sign-up sheet out here for our mailing list, and just to give a quick plug, May 2nd of next year, I'm really excited to share that we'll be bringing Dr. Sue Sisley to Humboldt County with support from the Humboldt Patient Resource Center. She is one of the few scientists in the country who has DA licensing to do clinical work involving cannabis to treat PTSD in veterans. She's doing a lot of really interesting, groundbreaking work. So get on our mailing list if you're interested in finding out about that event. So I'd like to introduce my colleague, Carly Marino, who will be introducing Scott. So thank you.
So I want to welcome you all to this new Special Collections space, which opened on March 1st, 2018. And so this space really represents how we feel about research. So it should be open, welcoming, and an inclusive space to study the communities, industries, and the environment that defines Northwestern California. So I'm so pleased to announce that the Chronic Freedom series will be available to researchers at the HSU Library here in Special Collections, thanks to the generosity of Joan Berman, former Special Collections librarian. So both Joan and Edie Butler, former archivist of the library, worked hard to collect and disseminate primary source material related to the cannabis communities in Northern California. And so I would like to sincerely thank Joan Berman for making this collection available at HSU. So I'm going to, another round of applause. Go ahead and stand up. Really fortunate. And I also want to thank the Altruistic Behavior Institute and the Humboldt Institute for Interdisciplinary Marijuana Research who made this event possible. So this is great. And so now, without further ado, I'm excited to introduce Scott Holmquist. So Scott was born in Minneapolis and is a U.S.-French conceptual artist who produces books, archives, and multimedia installations. Holmquist installations have shown throughout Europe, in New York, Los Angeles, and in Eureka. So all up there. Let's go, Eureka. So he's received support from Conservation International, the New York State Council of the Arts, Rosa Luxemburg's Stiftung Berlin, Heinrich Boll Foundation, Furthermore Inc., and Friedrichshain Kreuzberg Museum. Holmquist's work has received considerable media attention. In 2013, the Washington Post described his work as political yet whimsical. He currently resides in Berlin, so please join me in welcoming Scott Holmquist.
Okay. Hello. I'll
Speak into the microphone.
yeah. I'm gonna take out the beads. And here. There. Is this on? Is it on?
There we go.
I need the help. I don't have the professional pipes. Stay open. Thanks, Carly. Thank you, Josh. And thank you very much, Joan, for supporting this work. It supports more work this way. I think you know that. And thank you, Jane and David and Drew and Don, wherever he is. This skit, like my series, is an artifact of worlds that are disappearing or gone already. And this performance, in particular, is a kind of magic with a K bookend to the death of hippie action organized 50 years ago by David and Jane and their fellow diggers in order to bury the media-made images of what hippies were supposed to be. This was at the end of the disastrous Summer of Love. Disastrous for the project of the human freedom projects that were underway at the time. So, thank you again, David and Jane. May this bookend here transmit some kind of good germs and spirits, the spirits of human possibility and freedom going forward. Possibility of some kind of rebirth usually requires some kind of death. These are 6 of 10 icons developed by curators at the Oakland Museum for their exhibit on cannabis in California called Altered States. Actually, the boss of this crew of curators is sitting right here, Terry Newell, who now lives in Arkansas, is that right? Yeah. This crew of curators got wind of my work, contacted me to help them with what one of their number described as, quote, the hard-to-articulate aesthetic of the Emerald Triangle. I'm gonna back up a little just to describe. Okay, this is six of 10 icons that were developed to organize the material, and the 6 that made it onto the coasters that went into the cannabis merchandise area were for medical marijuana, medical cannabis, cannabis as a means of a means to facilitate artistic production, for fun, for spiritual practice, and then the plant as the plant, and then evil weed, which is the most complicated of these, because it has to do with kind of the political, social history of pot prohibition. Need more water, excuse me. So back to this hard to articulate aesthetic of the Emerald Triangle. When I came, I offered my story of, or the way I interpreted what I learned through the process of doing these books, and with a lot of help from people who knew a great deal. One of them sitting right here, Douglas Fir, who educated me on many of the details that I would have never known about. I suggested that they use the concept of insurgency, a successful insurgency, to get at this this aesthetic. I don't think that by aesthetic they meant camo design. I think really they were talking about a feeling, but aesthetic is not such a bad word either. They intended to use self-reported stories of working in what had by then people called the cannabis industry. Joe, this was supposed to be whiskey. Their decision to use self-reported stories of working in cannabis, I thought that was absolutely the right direction to get at this special, this undescribable thing that they wanted to get at. Many people have referred to over the years, many writers have tried to write about and pretty consistently failed to get at. And I think while they were on the right direction, they were on the wrong track, which brings me to Karl Marx. No laughs. Okay. who it turns out has a lot in common with weed. For instance, both are hidden everywhere in plain sight. Where's Josh? Thank you. Right here. Thank you, Josh. I borrowed the title from a recent paper by him on this related subject. And so they have this in common. It's everywhere in our thinking, everywhere in our social science practices. Karl's there. But also, and cannabis too, in the history and so forth. Okay. And in people's thinking, cannabis is a gateway drug to social and personal disaster. Our current top cop is one of these people, right? In the same way that Marx is the gateway thinker to social and political disaster, right? It's funny. I think it's hilarious. Okay. And Marx, okay, and just as Marx and cannabis, at the same time, for a bunch of other people, Marx and cannabis are destined to save the planet, right? I like the optimistic possibility more than the other ones. So I'm gonna use Marx that way. So short of saving the planet, I have a hunch that Marx offers a path to understanding this hard to articulate aesthetic. Okay? And namely, and this is where I'll get boring, namely in his concept of social relations in capitalism, in which people are situated in the processes of production and capital accumulation in ways that in contemporary social theory, it's probably better to refer to power relations. But now I'm going to lose it here. Sorry. I just want to keep this narrowly focused. Okay. So the power relations between so-called, and I will use so-called to say that in quotes, so-called workers and so-called employers in weed production have not been like those in the economy around it. very significantly. And this was true whether you were a gentle, a grower who had all kinds of elaborate personal ethics that governed how you organized work, or you were the worst, badass, tough gangster grower. You were all being disciplined by the same possibility, which is your workers could always completely obliterate your capital. And I would argue that it wasn't capital. That is, we have relations. Well, I'm getting off my thing. I have to stick to the page. Okay. So in this case, for 2 generations, the relationship between the state and workers and capital within illegal cannabis production was reversed, or at least radically equalized. Workers, so-called workers, I would argue that in cannabis production, the people who are so-called workers are always sort of partners. That it's a partner, that there's always a measure of partnership in a mutually agreed project of production, which, by the way, is what Marx described as communism. That is, everybody mutually agrees what they're going to do freely, and they do it. So this is, so I mean, but very significantly, the power shift between the worker and the state. The state typically, in almost all capitalist economies, is charged with protecting capital and disciplining workers who don't behave or are not subjected to it. And this varies in different economies, but that's typically the role of the state in capitalist development. Okay, it's going to stay boring for a while. What does this have to do with art? Okay, it has to do with art because it has to do with the intersections of possible understandings. And so that's why I'm going to force you through a little more. Okay, the result in the long term is that with almost all weed production, there is no stable capital good. There are no stable capital goods. Okay, does that resonate? It's like you can't, and so in a way you can't have capitalism. You can't have real capitalism unless you have stable capital goods that can be traded, that can be accumulated in a normal way. And these are defined and protected and tradable. Now you would say, people who know about this, they would say, well, what about land? Yeah, what about land? Again, the productive value of that capital can be erased in a heartbeat with a couple of cops. Always. Okay, so that, okay, I'm beating this, taking too long with that. Where these arrangements, where the arrangements, okay, and with regard to labor inputs, it's the same. So-called workers normally would normally negotiate individual terms of involvement. I'm not going to talk about the generation or the decades-long exchanges between individuals who become like family members coming to trim weed and so forth. That's all on the level of just what is personal and what may be experienced personally. I believe that those relationships evolved in these kind of concrete conditions. It was these conditions that made it possible for people to have more human relationships. Where these relationships function best, the state, in fact, effectively withered away, as Marx predicted for communism. Where individuals join in process of production on their own terms, what Marx called life processes, they were not bound to the accumulation of capital because the enterprise could not really accumulate capital in the classic sense. Okay, we set the Marx goggles for another example. Alienated Labor, one of his earlier works before Capital. We understand that many who do weed work do not feel alienated from their work. That they don't. I mean, they have a relationship to the product, even if you might look down your nose at it, because they love it. They love to be stoned, and they generally, these workers, it's very rare that workers in the cannabis world aren't allowed to be stoned while they work. There are no drug tests. And so they're not, what they're making isn't some commodity that they have nothing to do with. It's something in a way to. So again, in this case, it's not like production in under normal capitalist conditions. So now we get to the orgasmic social consciousness. What happened, which is what I describe as this hippies and weed insurgency, and maybe I'm going to stop for a minute. This flag is made it's an imagined battle flag from some far distant future. Did anyone listen to the little things that were up here? One person? This isn't true. You have no idea how much work went into providing these little listens.
Tell us about it.
It was epic.
I'd read it. I would have to tell. No, it's too complicated. I'm not going to tell you all about it. This will take too much time. But basically, it's part of a future museum I designed that would contain artifacts from a future world. This museum is originally built by communist Clipper rebellion like 1,000 years from now in some post-industrial period where these rebels find the Chronic Freedom series, of course, and it provides them with the revolutionary conceptual means to carry out this revolution. And I mean, of course, this revolution doesn't last very long, but while it lasted, they succeeded in convincing all of their adversaries to join the party. And during this period, they build the museum. These elements are actually quite significant because they come originally from the hand of Frank Cichorka, who had this amazing career at first organizing voters in the South, being beaten up, learning to carry a gun and brandish a gun when being threatened on the roads of Alabama. Later used his abilities with weapons and cars to become a bodyguard for Black Panther in the Bay Area. Eventually, and during that period, illustrated an important, the first history of African American, an illustrated book of African American history in the 60s. I forget the name now, but that was part of this installation too. That's Frank Cichorka. Then he ended up kind of burning out and ended up growing pot and being busted and living out the rest of his days in southern Humboldt, during which time, I'm not supposed to talk fast, well, he also sketched this fist, this woodcut, which became the most used fist symbol in the student movements in the late 60s and the early 70s. He later made these woodcuts, which I altered a little bit to fit, for Star Route in southern Humboldt County. Okay, you got it. Now you would all have known that if you would have listened. You should already have that. So, maybe we don't. You guys already did this about the orgasmic thing, so I don't need to talk about that. But I believe it's significant that the period where we can observe, and what I observed in the process of assembling this material, the most intense activity, the most institutions founded and expanded, cultural production, political activities, a project building hospitals in Vietnam, all of these things took place during the period of most repression of the pot scene. In other words, who was left? There were people who built networks that were even less bound to traditional capitalist social relations. And during that period, I mean, there was this flourishing: less money, more socialism, and more institutional. I mean, it's true that they had the advantage, and this is the interesting part. Sorry, I'm getting off my text, but the very interesting part in all of this, and I'll save it to the end. So I'm not going to run down the list of all the things that were established during this period of this peak. I should. Okay, during this. Okay, well, during this period, the peak period of this insurgency. During the peak period of this insurgency, more than one environmental organization was established, but better than just organizations, with professional staff, which seemed to be the death knell of really effective work. In many cases, these amateur environmentalists changed national environmental law. One of the key people in that story happens to be sitting here, Robert Wood Sutherland, who was one of the commandos in this whole thing. So that happened, starting really effectively in terms of the political work in the late 70s, reaching its peak again through the 1980s during the period of highest repression. At the same time, these people were organizing to push back the cops, organizing, putting on armbands, like running in the house when the helicopters land, grabbing their armband, stashing their IDs, coming out the other side of their property, coming down on the other side with a camera to document the cops and make sure the cops were not violating their civil rights while they violated their property. But in the process of gathering this material, they used what I think is essential in this too, which is an effective, liberal, bourgeois state. This is the kind of the paradox, or like what conditions allow the possibility of this kind of communism? Well, you need this bourgeois state there as this kind of, well, no, I leave that to this social scientist. But that's what I see. Because there are a couple of other examples, but I won't get to them all. How are we doing for time? Let's see. I didn't go down the whole list. Okay, does somebody really want me to go down the whole list? I just got to, okay. They established, I'm going to do the list, okay? They established a financial institution, the Mateo Community Center, Radical Midwives. She's one of the key ones, and they're supposed to be rotating. These Radical Midwives established a health center for women in the back of a laundromat in the mid-'70s, which became the launching pad in a way for the credit union, the community center, organizing summer arts fair. I don't know if Kmart was organized there. I don't think so, but eventually they ended up with a radio station, which is now one of the major radio stations in the region. In this same period, they launched a legal camp. They were the key players, in the legal campaign that succeeded in getting a statewide regulation and pushback of pot enforcement. The annual arts and music festivals that were established ran for decades and were highly successful and internationally recognized. The community center, the same. During the same period, there were multiple theater groups that produced work that traveled around the world. Two of the people who were very involved in that are here. Theater and dance works. They organized. There were peace protests organized where the largest single contingent showing up in 2 or 3 buses would be from this tiny place in Humboldt County, and they would come with their own legal counsel. Okay, there were newspapers. All of this. Now, I offer in the description of the talk to say why this is not explained by what up to now has been kind of the way to describe what was so good about what happened as just, it's just a normal American story in terms of this kind of Jeffersonian democracy, this idea of Jeffersonian democracy, which is you have independent farms, and that creates the possibility for free association between independent farms, and that leads to a good kind of democracy. That I don't believe is any use whatsoever in describing the redistribution of power in social relations inherent in illegal production, which is kind of a ground floor. So you get nothing from this Jeffersonian idea from that. You also get no help whatsoever in understanding the importance of industrial capitalist production around what's happening in this area. I mean, in around this insurgency, which is key to aspects of it, from the petroleum, the high-tech petroleum products that go into their drip irrigation, to the solar panels that power their homes. Well, it might have something to do with Marx, understanding it. The story of what happened has, in a way, nothing to do with weed, and everything to do with politics, and the politics of the people who came there. It could have been LSD, it could have been something else. I have to get to other things, but I will inject here that I believe, and economists and sociologists may be able to prove this or not, but I suspect that a careful look at the story here will find that radical leftists and environmentalists are actually directly responsible for creating the Northern California marijuana economy, even if it will be ripped from their hands, because we are now entering a period of normal capitalist social relations. So, I'm not sure that any capitalism will help. Might. Anyway, during this entire story, it's no surprise that mass media could never communicate what was going on, because they did not have a lens through which to describe it. This is part of the reason why I did this work the way I did it. One of the problems with mass media, or any attempt to communicate with people who don't already have a sense, kind of even a sense physically of what these worlds are about, tends to rely on frameworks that either harm the subject or so completely distort it that the thing itself loses its possible meanings. And so this is something made for the outside world, but these books and their installation, which was up until now, with rare exceptions, always in private homesteads or private shared spaces that were, for the most part, exclusively visited by people who knew about what it was about. And the idea was a density by compressing a kind of insane, like really dense amount of traces of the experiences, and then the way those traces of those experiences in local reporting, in local photographs, and then in local media. Media produced, for instance, by somebody in the watershed, like the Gulch Mulch, and at the same time showing how that these same stories are told on 60 Minutes, in the New York Times, and so forth. The same with individuals. An obituary by a person who's close to people in these communities in the New York Times. I do a parallel write-up of that person interviewing his brother, revealing that an important part of this guy's life was dealing weed and driving it down. This guy. They didn't mention that in the New York Times write-up. So this work was an attempt to, and this is where the possibility of a kind of art and ethnology comes into the story. The work was about trying to create the possibility of a spark or a sustained resonance between the subjects and works or sources of reference, an archive, where there would be kind of little tiny reflections, like little teeny mirrors or windows into things that the participants, the subjects, would see and be moved by. And that was the conceit. That's what this work here is about. And it's also about making objects that have the potential of being a kind of enduring propaganda for this insurgency. And that's, and I'm totally off my thing, so I have no clue what I'm saying. But I'm going to return to it. The fact that social relations in these life processes are not blah, 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 that's not so interesting. Okay, yeah, for those who don't know, I wrote an essay entitled Against Dialogue for Speaking Only to Ourselves, and I meant it. The idea was to create a possibility of closed interaction that could, in my view, set the stage for a kind of heightened experience of these worlds that was always being kind of damped down in every contact with the world, even, and I believe even with the mass media produced by these people, Kmart. There was, yeah, I mean, I'm not going to get into too much why I think that, but I think that the requirements of mass communication have to be harmful to mass communication that overflows into parts of the culture, the dominant culture, is always bound to be harmful in the same way that any other mass media is to the subject when that subject is an insurgent subject or culture. It's kind of hardwired into the structure of how the media works. You don't see who you're talking to, for instance. What you say is always subject to inspection by the enemy, if you want. So now I was going to show the books, but I'm not going to do that. Instead, I want to get to another person that brings Marx back into it and porn, and that is Sam Delaney. Do people know? Does anybody know who Sam Delaney is? Sam Delaney is one of the most prolific American writers of any sort. He identifies himself as black, gay, and Marxian. He's also a social theorist. He's most known for science fiction. I actually don't read science fiction much, so I might not have known about him. Sam Delaney wrote a book called Times Square Red, Times Square Blue some years ago, in which he describes in great detail the joyous fraternity, mostly fraternity, that he experienced in the porn cinemas in New York City from the mid-'60s into the '90s. And he wrote about this in response to an argument, a battle between him and a more classical Marxist intellectual, Marshall Berman. And if anybody knows Marshall Berman, in New York, where Marshall was favoring the Disneyfication of Times Square, Sam Delaney was arguing against it. When he described his encounters, he described a world that I recognize visiting an event at Beginnings in the late '80s. That is a space where cross-class, cross-culture isn't so evident in Humboldt County, but the cross-class and the sustained cross-class interactions always blew me away. And I think middle-class people actually don't register it as strongly. I'm very sensitive to it because I'm uptight about my class origins, working class, and so I saw it like, wow. I mean, I've never observed this anywhere. And he describes exactly that. People were entering a space, I will argue in the case of Times Square, especially at the height of what he describes, a space where capital, social relations, to capital anyway, were destabilized. The property wasn't worth much. There was definitely sex exchanged for money. Although, he described situations where there were these young men who were like working class, probably bisexual, maybe homosexual, and they basically wanted to have sex with a man. And they would take some money as just a gesture that would kind of insulate them from the stigma of being queer. So he, anyway, what's happening in this space is a trade. There is business going on that is outside the normal social relations in capitalism. And then there are people who are involved in it and coming into contact with each other. And this is what he theorized. He theorizes this contact and the possibilities of it. Which brings us to the hopeful end, which is maybe the only possibility for communism. It will be, or communism or some other kind of wonderful future, are new modes of illegality. We need to find finding weak zones of weak capital, weak law enforcement, but disciplined. This is very important because when it goes crazy, it's not pretty. Disciplined by some eternal liberal bourgeois democracy that respects some measure of civil rights. Sometimes you have to fight for them, but eventually kind of come around. So that, I think, maybe this is maybe the path to Marxist communism. So, do you have any questions about art? I'll see what I can do.